my name is Dan Quinn. I'm an extension corn agronomist with Purdue University. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about assessing hail damage in corn. So the first slide I have here is just looking at two different time points during the growing season, where we are looking at how hail can impact corn. I'm going to kind of talk about corn in terms of hail damage early in the season, so when corn is in that vegetative growth stages, but also talk about some of the hail damage that can occur, in the later season as well. So the picture on the left is corn that was injured by hail kind of earlier in the season, and the picture on the right here is corn that was damaged by severe hailstorm kind of later in the season. So when we think about how corn can be impacted by hail, there's really three main components as to what causes yield loss in corn, and how it's really impacted by hail damage during the season. The first one is plant stand reduction. So we think about severe hailstorms that can actually kind of damage the stalk of the plants, can damage the growing point of the plants, and actually really reduce that plant stand. And reducing that plant stand can then translate to yield losses at the end of the year. Another area where hail can impact corn and impact the yield is just through direct damage to the plant. So it can occur from just hitting that stalk, bruising that stalk, causing issues on that stalk. But also later in the season, you think about as the ear is being developed, if it's getting hit with hail, that can actually damage the ear. It can damage, outside the husk, can damage the ear and cause yield loss in that frame too. But probably the most prevalent area where corn is damaged and where a lot of that yield loss comes from hail damage is due to leaf defoliation, right? So that is very dependent on what percentage of that leaf defoliation occurs. But that's probably the primary mechanism of where a lot of that yield loss occurs when corn is impacted by a hailstorm. So thinking about, okay, we have a hailstorm, okay, how do we assess what the damage is? How do we assess what the potential yield losses are in the field? And probably the most important point after a hailstorm is to, one, understand what are my growth stages in corn. That is very important for any crop scout. It's very important to assessing any types of stress or any types of damage and what that potential yield loss is going to be. So in terms of hail damage in corn, it's really important to understand, okay, what growth stage is that corn at? So this picture here on the left is looking at the vegetative growth stages. So I'm going to kind of separate it between the vegetative growth stages of corn, but also the reproductive stages of corn. So vegetative growth stages of corn are typically called the V stages. They're often referred to or referenced to the number of leaves or the number of collared leaves on the plant. And then we get into the R stages. So the R stages, the reproductive stages, that's when we get past, pollination, and we get into ear formation. And a lot of the growth stages are more dictated based on where that ear is in development. So we're going to talk kind of, split up this talk in terms of hail damage, in terms of impacts during the vegetative stages, but also impacts of hail during the reproductive stages of corn. And another important point for this too is that total yield loss caused by hail damage and really focusing on the leaf defoliation impacts is directly related to what growth stage that corn plant is at. So that's why it's just so key to really understand what growth stages they are and understand how to identify those in the field, so you can properly assess what is the total damage, what is that potential yield loss going to be from the hail damage. So again, this slide here is just kind of giving a little bit of an overview and a little bit of detail about some of the growth stages in corn, both on the vegetative side and the reproductive side. I've highlighted in red some really critical growth stages when it comes to assessing hail damage. So on the left-hand side here, we have the vegetative growth stages. They start at VE, which is emergence. I've highlighted here the V6 growth stage, which is the sixth leaf on that plant has a visible collar. That is important from a hail damage standpoint, because that is the point in time when corn actually has that growing point. So that meristematic tissue, that growing point, it's a really, important part of that plant. And that growing point actually emerges out of the ground at that point in time. So you think about corn that is pre V6, it's going to be a lot more tolerant to severe hail damage because that growing point is below the ground. And as we get to V6 and that growing point comes out of the ground, that corn plant is going to become a lot more susceptible to hail damage because that hail can actually directly impact that growing point and actually potentially kill that plant and, severely stunt that plant. And that's where some of that stand loss comes in. I also have highlighted here the VT growth stage. So the VT growth stage is when that tassel emerge, or that lowest tassel branch on that corn plant is visible. When we think about hail damage in corn, you think about leaf defoliation corn. This is the growth stage that is the most critical in terms of leaf defoliation. If we have 100% leaf defoliation at this point in time, we could have 100% yield loss. So it's a very, very critical growth stage for corn, for understanding what is my potential yield loss due to hail damage. And then this next table I brought up on the slide on the right hand side is really looking at the reproductive growth stages of corn, right? So this is where we switch from the vegetative growth to now that corn plant is the tassels emerged, the silks have emerged, and now we're into those R growth stages where we're really focusing on, what is the development of the ear at that point in time to help us determine what that growth stage is. And here I have highlighted in red the R1 growth stage. So the R1 growth stage, very similar timing to that VT, that tassel emergence. So R1 is when those silks are emerging outside the husk. That is another very critical growth stage in terms of potential yield loss caused by hail damage. So if we have severe leaf defoliation at that point in time, we're probably going to see a pretty severe yield loss. And as we work our way more towards maturity, so R6, as that corn plant gets more mature, gets closer to black layer, closer to harvest, our chances of potential yield loss caused by hail damage actually goes down. So kind of opposite on the vegetative side, as that corn plant progresses through that vegetative stages get closer to pollination, our potential yield loss caused by hail goes up. But on the reproductive side, as we move from pollination through grain fill and closer to maturity and harvest, that potential yield loss caused by hail damage actually reduces or decreases over that point in time. So I'm going to first start out by assessing hail damage in young corn plants. So I kind of talked about we're going to focus on, the young corn plants, the vegetative growth period, and then we're going to switch to what that hail damage can be in the reproductive period and that late season hail damage. So when it comes to assessing hail damage in young corn plants, there's really two primary mechanisms where yield is impacted in corn from hail damage in young corn. The first one is, we kind of touched on this, is reduced plant stand. And that's, typically a function of is that growing point out of the ground? Did it cause severe damage of that growing point? Did it actually cause some plants to desiccate or die? And we actually reduce that overall plant stand. And also leaf defoliation. So leaf defoliation, are we losing a lot of leaves, defoliating a lot of leaves? That can also cause an impact on corn yield, depending on what vegetative growth stage that corn plant is in. So again, it's really important when assessing hail damage in corn is really understanding, okay, what current growth stage is that corn at? So we know what the growth stage is, we can get a better idea of how much that corn plant is going to be impacted by the hail. And the first important point, and I touched on this, was really understanding, okay, the V6 growth stage in corn. So right around, V5, V6 growth stage, that is when that growing point actually moves out of the ground. When that growing point moves out of the ground, that corn plant is going to become much more susceptible to hail damage than if, say, that growing point was below the ground. So it's important to understand what that growth stage is. And then if we understand, okay, maybe it's V6 or more progressed, that growing point is going to be out of the ground. So now we need to assess what is the health of that growing point. So if the growing point is above the ground, it'll be important at that point in time to actually split some stalks, find that growing point region and really look at the overall health of that growing point region. If we can assess the overall health of that growing point region, that'll give us a pretty good idea of whether or not that corn plant will survive or where maybe that corn plant won't survive. And also a really important point with hail damage, and something, we got to try to stress to both scouts and farmers, is to be patient, right? So a lot of times with hail damage, especially in the young stages, the vegetative stages, it can often look a lot worse than what it actually is. You look at tattered, torn leaves, corn plants that maybe just completely knocked down at that point in time. But it's important to give it some patience so we can assess the survivability of those plants. So typically you'll start to see regrowth in corn in about 3 to 5 days. So it's important to, be patient, give that corn plant some time so we can truly assess what that regrowth potential is going to be. And then, especially if that growing point is above the ground, there's a very good chance if that growing point is above the ground, or that growing point wasn't severely damaged, that corn plant is going to recover, and it's going to recover well. But we have to be patient to understand and assess what that regrowth potential is. So the picture's on the left. So I share this picture here. And this is just looking at, okay, what does that growing point region look like? And where do we look for that growing point region? So I have talked a lot about the growing point. So this corn is, this is a split stalk image. This corn is about the V6, V7 growth stage. You can see the nodes in this plant. But overall, there's kind of a triangle area, and you can actually see where the tassel is at this point in time in that corn plant. And it almost looks like a telescope where those nodes are, and you can actually see that tassel. And I kind of have it highlighted here on this figure of actually where that growing point region is. So, it's important if we're past V6, okay, we've got severe hail damage. Okay, now we need to go out, look, split some stalks, assess where the growing point is, and also understand whether or not there is severe damage to the growing point. Is there severe bruising? Does it look like there's just severe damage to that growing point where there's a pretty good potential that corn plant isn't going to survive? And then on the right-hand side is a picture looking at, the total recovery or the plant recovery of that corn plant. So you can see in this picture, young corn that was pretty devastated by hail damage. But that growing point at that point in time was preserved. It wasn't severely damaged. And you can actually see we're starting to see some pretty adequate regrowth from that corn plant. So that's why it's really important to be patient when assessing hail damage, and to look at the survivability of those plants after, say, 3 to 5 days before we make the final call on whether or not that corn is going to survive or not. Another issue that can happen with hail damage at this point in time is both stem bruising and also whorl damage. So you think about whorls and the unrolling of those leaves, especially during the vegetative stages, those can be damaged due to hail damage. And also leaf defoliation, right? We talk about leaf defoliation. In terms of stem bruising and whorl damage, it's often very difficult to quantify yield losses. But if you have severe damage to that whorl area, that can cause restriction of newly emerging leaves from the whorl, that can cause issues in the plant. And also too, in terms of stem bruising, it's kind of similar to assessing the damage to the growing point, where we're actually want to understand, okay, how deep is that bruising? Is it really going to impact maybe the translocation of water and nutrients in that plant? So again, splitting those stalks, assessing the health of the stem, both the growing point and the stem, to see if there's any potential issues at that point in time. Another big area is obviously leaf defoliation. That's probably the big thing that comes to mind in terms of hail damage in corn. Leaf damage and defoliation and caused by hail a lot of times just looks worse than it actually is, and that's kind of why we're back to being patient, and then especially at those young growth stages. The young vegetative growth stages, corn can tolerate a lot of leaf loss at that point in time. It's just not going to lose a lot of yield. It can recover quite well at that point in time. And another important aspect about this is when we're looking at and evaluating leaf defoliation, what we're really trying to look at is actually what the leaves that have been completely detached from the plant. So if you're seeing, tattered leaves, torn up leaves that are still attached to that corn plant, those leaves can actually still photosynthesize. And that's important because those leaves are still going to help that plant. So we often don't refer to those as, complete defoliation, because those leaves are still photosynthesizing, still attached to that plant, and still can help that plant produce yield. So I shared this graph right here or this table right here, and this is really common that you see. This is from the USDA, the USDA Corn Loss Adjustment Standards Handbook. And this is where, a lot of work has been done at looking at, okay, what are the yield loss impacts caused by percent leaf area destroyed, or what percent leaf area or percent leaf defoliation. And it's based on growth stages, right? So we think about the 7 leaf. So the 7 leaf, what's interesting about these tables is, I often talk about vegetative stages, V stages, and the collared leaf stages. Here, and a lot of times the crop insurance and also the corn loss adjustment handbooks, they refer to actually the number of leaves. They don't go by collared growth stages. They go by more so the leaf state, the number of leaves at that point in time. So that's important to understand when looking at these tables. So you look at the top of this table here, 7 leaf. You look at the 7 leaf growth stage. If we have 100% leaf defoliation or leaf loss, we're only losing 9% yield, right? So that's the point that corn plant can really tolerate a high amount of leaf damage or leaf loss at those young vegetative stages. And another important point too is to look on this right-hand side, 100% yield or 100% leaf loss, leaf area destroyed. That begins to increase as our growth stage progresses. So as we move up to, say, a 12 leaf growth stage, now with 100% leaf damage or leaf defoliation, we're losing about 30% yield. So as we progress more towards that pollination period, we are going to lose more yield from percent leaf defoliation. And that's the important part of really understanding what growth stage are we at out in the field to truly assess what is our potential yield loss caused by hail. So in terms of, assessing hail damage caused by young corn, these are just some examples and how to approach it from maybe a scout standpoint. The first point, and we've talked about this, and I'm going to keep, referring to this, is really to determine what vegetative growth stage that corn is at. That is very important to truly assess yield loss. And it's also important to assess, is that corn at, say the B5, B6 growth stage? If it is that growing point out of the ground? And then do we need to split that stalk and assess the health of that growing point? So check for any growing point damage so we can get a pretty good idea. Is there any stand loss issues occurring in that field? And also be patient, right? We talked about this, but wait 3 to 5 days in terms of assessing what that regrowth potential and that plant survival potential is. So you can also look at, taking stand counts at that point in time. So if we find that we do have severe growing point damage, severe plant damage that are causing, plant stand losses, then we can, 1, assess the survivability. 2, we can take stand counts at that point in time to even give us an even better understanding of what that potential yield loss is going to be. And also it's important to understand with corn is that stand loss reduction is not linear relationship to yield loss. Corn can tolerate and can compensate at pretty low plant populations. So it's important to understand, to look at replant guides, to look at, a lot of those studies that have assessed corn yield responses to plant populations to understand, okay, what is our potential yield loss going to be if we lose a significant amount of stand? And also assess that leaf defoliation for potential yield loss estimate based on that growth stage of the corn. So now I'm going to, quick switch gears here to looking at, we talked about the early season vegetative growth stages, but what about, late season hail damage and damage during the reproductive growth stages of that corn? At this point in time, yield losses are predominantly caused by both leaf defoliation and also stalk and ear damage at this point in time. And again, I'm going to keep highlighting this. It's important to understand what growth stage that corn plant is at. If we know what the growth stage is, it can help us understand what is our yield loss severity, especially due to leaf defoliation at that point in time. So this picture on the right, you can see just some of that fairly severe hail damage, leaf defoliation caused by a late season hail event. So leaf defoliation from late season corn, again, kind of similar to early season corn. It often looks a lot worse than it actually is. tattered leaves, so the tattered and torn leaves, but they are still attached to that plant, still will photosynthesize. And we typically don't classify those as, a percent leaf damage or complete leaf loss. If they're still attached, even if they are tattered and torn, they can still photosynthesize and help that plant produce yield. Yield loss from hail damage is, and I've talked about this before, it's just its greatest point during critical pollination period. So that VT R1. And as we move from VT R1, go through the grain fill stages, get closer to maturity and harvest, that yield loss potential is going to go down. So you think about 100% yield or 100% leaf defoliation at VT could potentially lead to 100% yield loss. So it's very significant at that point in time. And again, it's important to understand what is our percent yield loss to estimate yield loss. And another interesting aspect too is, kind of maybe one benefit. I don't know if there is a true benefit from hail damage, but if we do have leaf defoliation, that can actually help advance grain drying at harvest. And this is just due to some of that increased air movement throughout that canopy of that crop. So this is kind of similar table that I showed before, just looking at, okay, what is our percent leaf area destroyed? What is our growth stage here on the left-hand side? And again, this is from the USDA Corn Loss Adjustment Standards Handbook 2020. But you can see that leaf defoliation yield loss at this point in time is way more significant than what it would be at those younger vegetative growth stages. You look at VT tassel, again, if we have 100% leaf area destroyed, that's going to result in 100% yield loss. But that number, that percentage, or that total leaf or that total yield loss caused by 100% leaf area damage does decrease as we move towards maturity. And another aspect too of potential yield loss and something to watch for in terms of late season hail damage is really looking at ear damage. So if we have severe hail, large size hail, that can actually impact yield specifically by straight damage to that ear. So you can see from this picture here, about softball size hail from this field actually caused pretty severe damage to those ears. So in addition to both leaf loss, leaf defoliation, can actually also impact that ear and actually damage that ear itself. Another aspect too can be severe stalk damage, which potentially can cause lodging, severe stalk bruising, severe stalk damage. That's in very severe cases, but that can actually lead to some lodging on the back end of the season. So to wrap up here, just some take-home points in terms of assessing hail damage in corn. Again, kind of back to one of the most important things I talked about was really understanding what the growth stage of that corn is. And if we know what the growth stage of the corn is, that can give us a better idea of one, where do we need to look, and also two, what is going to be a pretty good estimate of what my percent yield loss is due to that hail damage. So again, if I'm in the vegetative growth stages, what is my vegetative growth stage? Is that growing point out of the ground? Okay, it is out of the ground. Do we need to split that stalk? Do we need to pay attention to that growing point health? And then give us a better idea of whether or not we do have some stand loss on top of also some leaf defoliation at that point in time. And also another important part is just to be patient with hail damage. And a lot of times that's easier said than done, especially for the farmers, but be patient. Leaf defoliation a lot of times looks worse than it is. It's important, especially in those vegetative growth period, those young corn plants, to give it about 3 to 5 days to really assess, is that plant going to regrow? Is there some survivability of that plant, or is it not going to survive? And do we count that as potential stand loss? Tattered leaves, again, tattered, torn leaves, but are still attached to that plant, can still photosynthesize and still can contribute to that plant in terms of yield development. And lastly, important part about assessing hail damage is a lot of times you work with the crop insurance agents, and something we always refer to as the crop insurance agents. They typically have their specific guidelines, and they are going to make that final call in terms of, what is that final yield loss estimate and so on. So working with those folks and understanding that the crop insurance agents do have their specific guidelines that they do follow, and they are going to have the final call in terms of determining what that final yield loss. But overall, again, I thank you for listening. If you have any questions or want any additional information, my email and different information here are on this slide. But thank you very much for listening.